A billionaire abandoned his pregnant girlfriend. 25 years later, a dinner revealed a truth, and he was left completely shattered. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Kensington estate, bathing the grand dining room in a pale, golden hue. Arthur Kensington sat alone at the head of an enormous oak table, a porcelain cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. His eyes wandered beyond the sprawling garden, where the frost clung stubbornly to the grass, to a horizon blurred by the promise of another chilly January day. Arthur, now in his early 60s, had amassed a fortune that spanned continents and industries. His name was etched on towering skyscrapers, whispered in boardrooms, and splashed across headlines. Yet here he was, enveloped in a silence so profound it threatened to consume him. The clink of his spoon against the cup seemed almost intrusive, an unintentional defiance of the quiet that had become his companion. On the table lay an assortment of photographs, each one more poignant than the last. There was one he could not look away from, a young woman with a wide smile and eyes that spoke of unshakable faith in the world. Her name, Emily, lingered on the edge of his thoughts, as haunting and gentle as the first notes of a forgotten song. She had been a part of his past, a chapter he had chosen to close hurriedly, selfishly, 25 years ago. Arthur reached for the picture, his hand trembling slightly. Emily had been his anchor during his formative years, a time when ambition burned brighter than compassion, but ambition had come at a cost. A heavy sigh escaped him as he traced her image with a finger, lost in the years they had shared and, more painfully, the ones they hadn't. As he gazed at her, he saw his younger self reflected in her eyes, a man driven by an insatiable desire for success. The memories came rushing back, vivid and merciless, arguments over their diverging paths, the moment he learned of her pregnancy, and the heart-wrenching choice he made to walk away. She had pleaded with him to stay, her voice trembling with both anger and hope. He had turned his back on her and their unborn child, telling himself it was for the best. Now, surrounded by everything he had built, mansions, cars, power, the emptiness was undeniable. It loomed large in the quiet halls of his home and gnawed at his conscience during sleepless nights. He had tried to fill the void with lavish parties, fleeting relationships, and relentless work. None had sufficed. None could replace the family he had abandoned. The sound of the doorbell pulled Arthur from his reverie. He frowned. Visitors were a rarity in his isolated world. Moments later, his butler, a stoic man named Walter, entered, holding a plain envelope. "This arrived for you, sir," Walter said, placing the envelope on the table with deliberate care. Arthur nodded, dismissing him with a polite thank you. His gaze lingered on the envelope. It bore no return address, only his name written in an elegant, almost familiar script. His fingers hesitated as he picked it up, the weight of its contents more psychological than physical. He unfolded the paper inside and read the brief, cryptic message. "Remember Emily." The words were a dagger, sharp and precise. They cut through the layers of his defenses, dredging up emotions he had buried long ago. He read the note again, searching for clues, a hidden meaning, a hint of who might have sent it. Nothing, just two words that carried the weight of a lifetime. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He scanned the room as if expecting Emily herself to appear, but of course, the space remained as still as ever. Questions swirled in his mind. Who had sent the note? Why now, after so many years? And what did it mean for the life he had so meticulously constructed? He stared out the window once more, but the view no longer brought him solace. The distant horizon, once a symbol of his success, now seemed cold and indifferent. For the first time in years, Arthur Kensington felt a stirring of something unfamiliar, an ache not just of regret, but of longing. He had spent decades running from the past, but it seemed the past was no longer content to let him escape. The coffee had gone cold by the time Arthur rose from his chair. The note remained in his hand, a tangible reminder of the unresolved chapter in his life. He tucked it into his pocket, feeling its edges press against him with every step. The ghosts of his choices were stirring, and Arthur knew this was only the beginning. Arthur Kensington paced the length of his study, the mysterious note still in his pocket. The room, filled with mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books and relics of his travels, felt suddenly claustrophobic. His mind churned with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Why now? Why remember Emily? He had buried that part of his life deep, so deep that even he had nearly forgotten it. But the name Emily reverberated like a bell tolling for something he could no longer ignore. In the days following the letter's arrival, memories came unbidden, sharp and unforgiving. He saw her face everywhere, on the mantel, in the photographs of strangers whose names he barely remembered, in the reflection of his own aging eyes, and most disturbingly, in the quiet moments of his solitude. Emily had once been his world. She had believed in him when no one else had, standing steadfast beside him when he was nothing more than a dreamer with more ambition than sense. The thought of her now was like staring into the sun, impossible to sustain for long without pain. Arthur's routine faltered. He found himself distracted during conference calls, his responses curt and distant. Walter, perceptive but discreet, began serving meals that Arthur barely touched. Even the sound of the clocks in the house seemed louder, marking time that felt both endless and fleeting. Then came the first phone call. It was late in the evening when the landline rang. Arthur rarely used it, preferring his mobile for the few calls he still entertained. Walter answered, his voice low and professional. After a brief exchange, he appeared at the study door. "A call for you, sir," Walter said, holding the receiver as if it was something fragile. The caller didn't leave a name. Arthur hesitated. "Did they say what it was about?" "No, sir, only that it was important." Reluctantly, Arthur took the receiver, his hand clammy against the cool plastic. "This is Arthur Kensington," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. There was silence on the other end. Then the faint sound of breathing. "Hello?" he prompted. A click ended the call. Arthur stared at the receiver for a long moment before replacing it. The unease that had been simmering now felt like a storm brewing. He dismissed it as a prank, but the encounter left him unsettled. The coincidence of the note and the call gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. The next morning, Arthur wandered aimlessly through the vast halls of the mansion. He paused in front of a glass cabinet housing keepsakes from his youth, a dusty trophy from a high school debate team, an old pocket watch, and, tucked away in a corner, a small music box. It was one of the few possessions Emily had left behind when they parted ways. The melody it played was faint now, its mechanism worn with age, but the sound still struck a chord in him. He hadn't touched it in decades. He opened the box hesitantly, half expecting some new revelation. Instead, it released a tinny tune that once filled their shared apartment with warmth and laughter. Arthur shut it abruptly, the weight of memory too much to bear. The phone rang again that evening. This time, Arthur answered immediately. "Who is this?" he demanded. The line crackled faintly. Then a voice, low and deliberate, spoke. "Do you remember Emily?" Arthur's heart froze. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone edged with both anger and fear. The caller did not respond. Instead, they hung up, leaving Arthur with only the sound of his own breathing in the silence. That night, sleep eluded him. He tossed and turned, fragments of the past blending with the present. Emily's laughter echoed in his dreams, mingling with the cries of an infant he had never seen, the child he had walked away from. The days passed, each one bringing new signs that the equilibrium he had clung to for so long was unraveling. Objects he had long forgotten seemed to resurface inexplicably. A scarf Emily had worn during their winters together appeared on the edge of his closet, though he swore he had discarded it years ago. A book she had gifted him fell from the shelves, its spine cracking loudly against the hardwood floor. Even the faint scent of her perfume seemed to linger in the air, though it was impossible. Arthur found himself questioning his sanity. Was he imagining these things? Or was someone trying to send him a message? Walter, ever discreet, began to notice the changes in his employer. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked one afternoon as Arthur sat staring out the window, his untouched lunch growing cold on the table. Arthur nodded stiffly. "Yes, Walter, just tired." The older man hesitated before bowing slightly and retreating. Arthur knew he wasn't convincing anyone, least of all himself. That evening, Arthur poured himself a generous glass of whiskey and sat in his dimly lit study. He stared at the music box on the desk, his thoughts spiraling. The note, the calls, the objects, none of it made sense, yet it all pointed back to one undeniable truth. His past was catching up with him. As the whiskey warmed his chest, Arthur allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He whispered into the emptiness of the room, "What do you want from me, Emily?" The shadows offered no reply, but deep inside, Arthur felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crack. The storm he had spent years outrunning was now at his door, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could keep it at bay. Arthur awoke to the pale light of dawn seeping through the heavy curtains of his bedroom. His sleep had been restless, haunted by fragmented dreams of Emily, their arguments, her tears, and a child he had never met. The ringing of the phone from the previous night still echoed in his ears, a taunting reminder that his past was no longer content to remain buried. He moved through his morning routine in a daze, the familiar luxury of his surroundings offering no comfort. The silver-framed mirror above the marble sink reflected a man who seemed older than his 63 years. His hair, once a sharp black, was now more salt than pepper. Lines of worry and regret etched themselves deep into his face, betraying the emotions he could no longer suppress. After dressing, Arthur wandered into his study. The music box still sat on his desk, its presence both nostalgic and accusatory. He reached for it, hesitated, then withdrew his hand. He couldn't bring himself to open it again. Instead, he turned to an old leather-bound journal tucked away on a high shelf. He had kept it during the years he spent with Emily, chronicling their struggles, their dreams, and, ultimately, their unraveling. He hadn't opened it since the day he left her. His hand hovered over it, the weight of the past suddenly tangible. But he couldn't yet face the words he had written in those youthful, reckless days. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. By evening, the mansion's oppressive silence became unbearable. Arthur found himself in the sitting room, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The crackling of the wood reminded him of the modest apartment he and Emily had once shared, where their fireplace had been nothing more than a gas heater with a fake log. They used to huddle near it on cold winter nights, dreaming of a future that now seemed like a cruel mirage. His thoughts were interrupted by the chime of the doorbell. The sound startled him. Unexpected visitors were a rarity. He set down his glass and moved to the front door, where Walter was already opening it. A deliveryman stood there, holding a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "For you, sir," Walter said, taking the package and handing it to Arthur. Arthur frowned, the weight of the package deceptively light. He carried it to the study, his pulse quickening as he unwrapped it. Inside was an object he recognized immediately, a pressed flower encased in glass. It was a white daisy, delicate and preserved perfectly, though its edges were browned with age. He hadn't seen it in over 2 decades. Emily had given it to him the night they decided to part ways, her voice trembling as she told him to keep it as a reminder of the love they had once shared. He had tucked it away in a drawer, unable to face its meaning. How had it returned to him now? A small note accompanied the flower, written in the same elegant script as the earlier message. It read, "You can't run forever." Arthur sank into his chair, clutching the note tightly. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger at whoever was behind this, fear of what was coming, and a deep, aching sadness for the years he had lost. He turned the flower over in his hands, its fragility a cruel metaphor for the life he had abandoned. That night, Arthur dreamed of Emily again. This time, they were in a park, the one near their old apartment where they used to walk on Sundays. She was laughing, holding his hand, her free hand resting protectively over her stomach. The dream shifted, and she was standing at a distance, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. She called to him, her voice carrying both longing and accusation. But as he moved toward her, she faded into the mist, leaving him alone. The next morning, Arthur resolved to push the past away. He immersed himself in work, holding meetings, reviewing contracts, and speaking with his lawyers. But the distractions were fleeting. The flower sat on his desk, its silent presence impossible to ignore. Later that day, an old colleague visited, someone Arthur hadn't seen in years. Charles, once a junior partner at his firm, had retired to a quieter life in upstate New York. They exchanged pleasantries, but as the conversation wore on, Charles grew somber. "Arthur," he said, swirling the scotch Arthur had poured for him, "I ran into someone who knew Emily not long ago." Arthur's hand froze mid-air, the glass of scotch halfway to his lips. "Emily?" he asked, his voice too sharp. "Yes," Charles replied, studying Arthur closely. "She asked about you." "Where?" Arthur pressed, leaning forward. "She lives in a small town on the coast now. She seemed fine, but there was something in her eyes." Arthur. "Like she was carrying a weight she couldn't quite set down." Arthur said nothing, his mind spinning. Emily was alive, and she had asked about him. The revelation was both a relief and a torment. He wanted to know more, but couldn't bring himself to ask. Charles eventually left, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. That evening, Arthur pulled the journal from its place on the shelf. His hands shook as he opened it, flipping through the pages filled with his younger self's handwriting. He stopped on a particular entry, dated the night Emily told him she was pregnant. The words were raw, filled with fear, ambition, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. He had convinced himself then that leaving was the right thing to do, for her and the child. Now, as he read the words, he saw them for what they were, excuses born of cowardice. He closed the journal, unable to continue. The weight of his past bore down on him with new intensity. He knew he could no longer avoid it. The notes, the calls, the flower, all of it was leading him towards something inevitable. Arthur Kensington, a man who had spent his life conquering the world, found himself on the brink of a battle he wasn't sure he could win. This time, the enemy wasn't external. It was the man he had been. And the only way forward was to confront what he had left behind. The afternoon sun cast a muted glow over the Kensington estate, its warmth doing little to ease the growing tension inside. Arthur sat by the wide bay window in his study, staring at the frost-covered garden, but his mind was far from the present. The journal he had reopened the night before now lay on the desk. its pages mocking him with memories he had tried to escape for decades. Each entry seemed to tug at a string, unraveling the carefully constructed tapestry of his life. He was still holding the daisy encased in glass, turning it over in his hands, when the phone rang. It startled him, the sudden sound breaking the oppressive quiet. For a moment, he considered letting Walter answer, but something compelled him to pick up the receiver himself. "Hello?" he said, his voice guarded. "Arthur, it's Helen." Arthur's breath caught. He hadn't spoken to his sister in years. Their relationship had become strained after their parents passed, leaving Helen to bear the burden of family connections while Arthur distanced himself in pursuit of his ambitions. "Helen," he said cautiously, "this is unexpected." Her tone was as sharp as he remembered. "I imagine it is. I've been trying to reach you for days." He frowned. "Is everything all right?" "Not everything is about business, Arthur," she snapped, though her voice softened slightly. "I'm calling because there's a gala next week, a fundraiser for the arts. You should come." "I don't have time for that," he replied automatically, though even as he said it, he realized how hollow it sounded. "You always say that," Helen retorted, "but you need to hear this. Emily's name has come up." Arthur's grip on the receiver tightened. "What are you talking about?" "There's been talk, Arthur. Someone mentioned her at a planning meeting, said she might still be connected to some of the causes you used to support. I thought you'd want to know." He was silent, the weight of her words settling on him. Emily, a name he had tried so hard to forget, was suddenly at the forefront of conversations in circles he had long since abandoned. "Arthur," Helen pressed, "if you want answers, the gala might be the place to find them. You've spent your life running from the past. Maybe it's time you stopped." "I'll think about it," he said curtly, eager to end the call. "You do that," she replied, her tone laced with skepticism. "But know this, there are some things you can't avoid forever." The line went dead, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts. Helen's words echoed in his mind, a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Over the next few days, the pressure built, the notes, the calls, the encounters, it all seemed to converge, leaving Arthur with an undeniable sense that something larger was at play. Each reminder of Emily chipped away at his carefully guarded defenses, forcing him to confront not only what he had done, but also what it had cost him. On the morning of the gala, Arthur found himself in his wardrobe, staring at the row of tailored suits that had once symbolized his success. He chose a dark grey one, understated but elegant, and tied his tie with a precision that belied his unsettled mind. As he adjusted his cuffs, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked composed, but his eyes betrayed an undercurrent of unease. The drive to the event was quiet, the city's winter streets passing by in a blur. Arthur's driver, sensing his mood, didn't attempt small talk. The gala was being held in a grand old theatre downtown, its marquee glowing warmly against the cold night. As Arthur stepped out of the car, he was greeted by the hum of polite chatter and the flash of cameras. Inside, the atmosphere was a blend of opulence and philanthropy. Guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Arthur moved through the crowd, nodding at acquaintances and offering polite smiles, but his focus was elsewhere. He scanned the room for any sign of Emily or someone who might hold the answers he sought. It wasn't long before a familiar voice called his name. He turned to see Helen, her sharp features softened by the glow of the chandeliers. She approached him, a glass of champagne in hand. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said, a hint of surprise in her tone. "Neither did I," he admitted. Helen studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a cluster of people near the stage. "There's someone you should meet." She led him across the room, weaving through the crowd until they reached a man with silver hair and a kind, weathered face. "Arthur, this is Benjamin Carter." He was a lawyer who worked with several charities Emily supported. Arthur extended his hand, his pulse quickening. "It's a pleasure." Benjamin shook his hand firmly, his gaze steady. "I've heard a great deal about you, Mr. Kensington." The three of them moved to a quieter corner where Benjamin began to speak. Emily was remarkable. She dedicated her life to causes that mattered, even when she didn't have much to give. She believed in making a difference. Arthur swallowed hard. "Do you know where she is now?" Benjamin hesitated, then nodded. "I do. But before I tell you, let me ask, what are you hoping to achieve by finding her?" The question caught Arthur off guard. What was he hoping for? Closure, redemption, or simply a chance to atone for what he had done? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "But I need to try." Benjamin studied him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and handed Arthur a sealed envelope. "When you're ready," he said, "but know this, she's moved on, Mr. Kensington. If you choose to step into her life again, it must be for the right reasons." Arthur took the envelope, his hand trembling slightly. The weight of it was disproportionate to its size, a symbol of the reckoning he could no longer avoid. As he left the gala that evening, the envelope pressed against his chest. Arthur felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, tempered by fear. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was willing to take a step toward it. Arthur sat in the back seat of his town car, the envelope from Benjamin Carter resting heavily in his lap. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white as the car moved through the winter night. He hadn't opened the envelope yet, though his fingers had traced its edges so many times they felt raw. The thought of what it might contain filled him with equal parts dread and anticipation. The car pulled into the long, winding drive of the Kensington estate, the mansion looming against the night sky like a relic of another time. As the driver opened the door for him, Arthur stepped out, the cold air biting at his face. He walked into the house, bypassing Walter's customary greeting, and went straight to the study. The room was dimly lit, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows. Arthur sank into the leather chair, the envelope still in his hand. The fireplace crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his chest. Finally, he slid his finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful, looping script. "If you truly wish to find her, start in Seabrook. But remember, the answers you seek may not be the ones you hope for." Arthur read the note several times, his mind turning over the implications. Seabrook. The name stirred a faint memory, a small coastal town, modest and unassuming, far removed from the world of wealth and power he inhabited. It was a place Emily had once mentioned, though the details escaped him now. Could she really be there, after all these years? He set the note down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This was it, the first tangible clue. Yet doubt gnawed at him. What right did he have to intrude on Emily's life after so long? Would she even want to see him? And what about the child, his child, a person he had never met, whose life he had abandoned before it even began? The questions hung heavy in the air, but Arthur knew he couldn't let them paralyze him. If he didn't act now, he might never have another chance. He reached for the journal on the desk, flipping to a blank page, and began to jot down thoughts. A habit he had abandoned years ago, but now felt oddly comforting. Hours later, Arthur folded the note and placed it in the journal. He had made up his mind. He would go to Seabrook. The following morning, Arthur informed Walter of his plans. The butler raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his years of service teaching him when not to pry. Arthur packed a single bag, filling it with simple clothes that would blend into a place like Seabrook. As he zipped the bag shut, he noticed something wedged in the corner of his closet, a photograph of himself and Emily, taken during their happier days. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her arm looped through his. He slipped the photo into the bag without hesitation. The drive to Seabrook was long and solitary. As the city gave way to countryside and the countryside to the coast, Arthur felt a strange mix of apprehension and determination. The town came into view as the sun dipped low in the sky, its modest buildings bathed in a soft, golden light. It was picturesque, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Arthur checked into a small inn on the edge of town, the wooden sign creaking in the wind. The innkeeper, a cheerful woman in her 60s, greeted him warmly and handed him a key to his room. "Not many visitors this time of year," she said with a smile. "What brings you to Seabrook?" "Just passing through," Arthur replied, forcing a polite smile. The room was modest but clean, its walls adorned with nautical-themed artwork. Arthur set his bag on the bed and sat down, his mind racing. He had no plan, no idea where to start. All he had was a name and a hope that it would lead him somewhere. That evening, he ventured into the town center. The streets were quiet, the shops closing for the night. He found a small diner with lights still glowing and stepped inside. The place was cozy, filled with the comforting scent of coffee and warm bread. A young waitress approached him, her smile friendly but reserved. "What can I get you?" she asked, handing him a menu. "Just coffee," Arthur replied, glancing around. The other patrons seemed to be locals, chatting softly among themselves. As he sipped his coffee, Arthur overheard bits of conversation, fishing conditions, local events, a winter fundraiser. None of it gave him any clues about Emily. He felt foolish sitting there, waiting for a sign that might never come. Then, as he prepared to leave, the door opened and a young woman walked in. She looked to be in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled into a loose braid and a quiet confidence in her stride. For a moment, Arthur froze. There was something about her, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. The waitress greeted her warmly. "Clara, you're late. Long shift." "Yeah," the young woman replied, brushing snow from her coat. "But it's done now." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Clara, the name resonated in his mind, though he didn't know why. He watched her as she moved toward a table, her features oddly familiar, like echoes of someone he had known. Could she be? The thought was too much to process. Arthur quickly paid his bill and stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He stood on the quiet street, his breath visible in the night, and looked back at the diner. For the first time in years, Arthur felt something stir deep within him, an unmistakable pull toward the truth. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he couldn't turn back now. The morning sun rose hesitantly over Seabrook, its light filtering through the curtains of Arthur's modest room at the inn. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about the young woman he had seen at the diner. Clara. The name lingered in his thoughts like a melody he couldn't place. Was she connected to Emily? To him? The resemblance was faint, but undeniable. Yet how could he approach her without exposing the years of silence and abandonment that now defined his past? Determined not to waste another day, Arthur ventured into town. The streets were quiet, the snow crunching underfoot as he made his way toward the small cafe he had noticed the night before. It sat on a corner, its large windows fogged with warmth and activity. Through the glass, he spotted Clara, bustling behind the counter with a grace that suggested familiarity with the space. Arthur hesitated at the door. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he turned away and began wandering aimlessly through the town, the salty breeze from the nearby ocean filling his lungs. He passed shops and homes, their modest facades a stark contrast to the opulence he was used to. Seabrook was a world apart from the life he had built for himself, and yet It felt strangely grounding. As he walked, Arthur noticed a small park near the edge of town. A bench overlooked the water, and sitting on it was a man he hadn't seen before. The man was older, his silver hair tucked under a well-worn hat, and he held a book in his lap, though he seemed more interested in the waves than the words. Arthur approached cautiously, drawn by an unspoken intuition. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. The man looked up, his expression calm but inquisitive. "Not at all." Arthur sat, the bench creaking softly beneath his weight. They sat in silence for a while, the rhythmic crash of waves filling the gaps where words might have been. "You're not from around here," the man finally said, his voice steady and measured. "No," Arthur admitted, "just visiting." The man nodded, as if that were explanation enough. "Seabrook's a quiet place. People don't come here unless they're looking for something or someone." Arthur stiffened, but the man's tone was nonchalant, almost casual. "I'm Benjamin Carter," the man said, offering his hand, "but most folks just call me Ben." Arthur shook it, the name triggering a flicker of recognition. "You're the one who gave me the envelope." Ben smiled faintly. "Guilty as charged." For a moment, Arthur was struck speechless. The man who had sent him on this journey was here, sitting beside him, as though waiting for this moment. "You knew I'd come," Arthur said finally. "I hoped you would," Ben replied. "Emily deserves that much." The mention of her name hit Arthur like a blow. "You knew her." "For a long time," Ben said. "She was something special. Always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." Arthur looked away, shame tightening his chest. "I don't know if I can make this right." Ben leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "That's not for me to say, but running hasn't done you any favors, has it?" Arthur's silence was answer enough. After a pause, Ben spoke again, his tone softer. "She never hated you, you know, even after everything. She always said you were trying to find your way, even if it meant losing hers." The words cut deeper than Arthur expected. He had convinced himself that Emily must have despised him for what he had done, but the idea that she had held on to even a sliver of compassion for him was almost unbearable. "Why are you telling me this?" Arthur asked, his voice raw. "Because you need to hear it," Ben said simply, "and because there's someone else who deserves to know the truth." Arthur's heart clenched. "Clara." Ben nodded. "She's strong, like her mother. But she's been searching for answers her whole life. She won't say it, but the questions eat away at her." Arthur swallowed hard. The realization that his absence had left such a mark on someone he had never even met was a weight he hadn't anticipated. "How do I even begin to explain?" "With honesty," Ben said, his gaze steady. "She may not forgive you right away. She may not forgive you at all. But you owe her the chance to decide for herself." Arthur looked out at the water, its surface reflecting the pale winter sun. The journey he had embarked on felt heavier now, more uncertain, but he couldn't deny the truth in Ben's words. "Why are you helping me?" Arthur asked. Ben smiled faintly. "Because Emily believed in second chances, and because I see a man who's trying to find his way, even if it took him a little too long." Arthur didn't respond. The waves continued their relentless rhythm, a reminder that time, like the tide, waited for no one. When he finally rose to leave, Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go to the cafe," he said. "Talk to her. It won't be easy, but it's a step." Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. He turned back toward the town, his steps slow but deliberate. As he approached the cafe, he paused outside, watching Clara through the window. She was laughing with a customer, her face lighting up in a way that reminded him painfully of Emily. Taking a deep breath, Arthur pushed the door open. The small bell above it jingled softly, and Clara glanced up from the counter. Their eyes met briefly before she turned back to her work, unaware of the significance of the man who had just entered. Arthur sat at a corner table, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he would say, or how she would react. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but undeniably real. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back. The early morning light filtered through the cafe's wide windows, illuminating the cozy space as the first customers trickled in. Arthur sat at the corner table, his coffee untouched, the steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. Across the room, Clara moved with practiced ease, balancing trays and exchanging pleasantries with patrons. She hadn't noticed him yet, or if she had, she gave no sign. Arthur studied her intently. Her dark hair caught the light in a way that reminded him achingly of Emily. There was a confidence to her movements, a quiet strength that tugged at something deep within him. He wanted to speak, to cross the room and introduce himself, but his feet felt like lead, his courage faltering under the weight of decades of absence. The cafe began to fill, and Clara grew busier. Arthur used the distraction to gather his thoughts, but each time he rehearsed what he might say, the words felt inadequate. How could he explain who he was? How could he bridge the chasm of years that lay between them? As he wrestled with his thoughts, the door to the cafe jingled open, and a man entered. He was tall, with sandy hair and an easy smile, and he greeted Clara with the familiarity of someone who belonged there. "Jack," Clara said, her face lighting up. "You're late." "Traffic," Jack replied, grinning. "Got caught behind a snowplow." Arthur watched as the two exchanged playful banter. Jack leaned casually against the counter, clearly at home in Clara's world. The warmth between them was unmistakable, and Arthur felt an unexpected pang of jealousy, not for Jack, but for the role he seemed to play in Clara's life, a role Arthur had forfeited before it had even begun. When Jack finally took a seat near the counter, Clara turned her attention to the next customer. Arthur realized his opportunity to speak with her was slipping away. Summoning what little courage he had, he stood and approached the counter. Clara glanced up as he neared, her expression polite but guarded. "What can I get for you?" she asked. Arthur hesitated. "Just another coffee." She nodded, moving to fill his order. As she did, Arthur's mind raced. This was his moment, but the words wouldn't come. When she returned with the coffee, he blurted out, "Clara, isn't it?" She frowned slightly, puzzled. "Yes. Do I know you?" Arthur shook his head quickly. "No. I'm new in town. Someone mentioned your name and I thought—" He trailed off, realizing how awkward he sounded. Clara's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her brow furrowing. Then she gave a small, polite smile. "Well, welcome to Seabrook." Arthur nodded and retreated to his table, cursing himself for his lack of composure. He sipped his coffee, his hands trembling slightly, and watched as Clara returned to her work. The conversation, if it could even be called that, had been brief, but it left him shaken. The hours crept by, and Arthur found himself walking aimlessly through the town once more. He passed the bookstore, the hardware shop, the church with its modest steeple, each place a reminder of how different this life was from his own. The world he had built, skyscrapers, boardrooms, luxury cars, felt so far removed from the quiet simplicity of Seabrook that it was almost laughable. That evening, back at the inn, Arthur sat by the window of his room, watching the snow fall gently outside. He thought about what Ben had said the day before. She won't say it, but the questions eat away at her. The words gnawed at him. How could he offer answers to questions he had spent decades avoiding? And yet, the longer he stayed, the more certain he became that he couldn't leave without trying. The following morning, Arthur woke early. He dressed in simple clothes, far removed from his usual tailored suits, and ventured to the cafe again. This time, he was determined to stay until he found the courage to speak. When he arrived, the cafe was quiet. Clara was wiping down tables, her expression relaxed, her movements unhurried. Arthur sat at his usual corner table and waited for her to notice him. After a few minutes, Clara approached, her demeanor polite but distant. "Back again?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Arthur nodded. "I've heard this place has the best coffee in town." She smiled faintly. "Small town, not much competition." Arthur took a deep breath. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. Clara paused, her brow furrowing. "Oh." "Yes," he continued. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Clara's gaze sharpened, and Arthur realized he had said too much. Before he could clarify, the door opened, and Jack entered again, his arrival breaking the moment. Clara turned away, her focus shifting to greet him. Arthur watched as she and Jack exchanged easy conversation, their laughter filling the space where his own words had failed. He felt the weight of his inadequacy, the years of silence pressing heavily on him. But as he sat there, he realized something. He couldn't keep skirting the edges of Clara's life, hoping for the right moment to reveal himself. There would never be a perfect moment. If he truly wanted to connect, he had to take a step forward, however small, however uncertain. When Clara returned to the counter, Arthur stood and approached her again. His heart pounded, but this time he didn't let it stop him. "Clara," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I think I might have known your mother." She froze, her eyes widening slightly. "My mother?" she echoed, her tone cautious. "Yes," Arthur said. Emily Walker." Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the cafe seemed to fall silent, the hum of conversation and clinking of dishes fading into the background. Then, slowly, she nodded. "She's talked about you," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not by name." "But I know who you are," Arthur's breath caught. "You do." Clara's gaze was piercing. "You're the man who left." The words hit him like a blow, but he didn't flinch. For the first time in years, Arthur Kensington stood his ground. "Yes," he said simply, "and I'm here because I want to make it right." The cafe seemed to hold its breath after Clara's words, the quiet hum of its usual atmosphere muted by the weight of their conversation. Arthur stood at the counter, his heart pounding as he met Clara's unflinching gaze. Her expression was a mixture of curiosity, guardedness, and something sharper, resentment, perhaps, or disbelief. "You want to make it right?" she repeated, her voice low and even. "What does that even mean?" Arthur swallowed hard. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to try. I need to try." Clara folded her arms, her posture stiffening. "It's been 25 years. What made you decide now was the time?" Arthur hesitated. How could he explain the complex swirl of regret, the haunting dreams, the note that had pulled him from his carefully constructed life? "I made mistakes," he said finally. "Mistakes I've lived with every day, but it wasn't until recently that I realized I couldn't keep running from them." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "So, you're here to ease your conscience, to check some moral box and go back to your big house and your big life?" Her words stung, but Arthur forced himself to remain calm. "No," he said softly. "I'm here because I want to know you, and because I owe you the truth." For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then she straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Truth," she echoed. "Then start with this. Why did you leave my mum? Why did you leave me?" The question cut through Arthur's defenses like a blade. He had prepared himself for anger, for skepticism, but hearing the pain in Clara's voice was far more devastating. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I was young," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "and selfish. Your mother and we had dreams, but they didn't align. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I thought staying would mean giving up everything I wanted to achieve. So I convinced myself that walking away was the right thing to do." Clara's eyes widened briefly, then narrowed again. "The right thing? You abandoned her. You abandoned us." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "You're right. It wasn't the right thing. It was cowardice, and it's haunted me every day since." Clara seemed to falter for a moment, as if caught between anger and something else. Perhaps the faintest flicker of understanding. Then she shook her head and stepped back from the counter. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said, her tone colder now. "You can't just show up and expect to fix everything with a heartfelt apology." "I don't expect anything," Arthur said quickly, "but I want to earn your trust, however long it takes." Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the back room of the cafe. Arthur stood there for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on him. He had taken the first step, but the path ahead felt even more uncertain. That evening, Arthur returned to the small inn where he was staying. The modest room, with its creaky bed and faint scent of lavender, felt both comforting and confining. He sat by the window, staring out at the darkened streets of Seabrook, replaying his conversation with Clara over and over in his mind. He had known this journey wouldn't be easy. Still, the pain in Clara's voice had pierced him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Her anger was justified, but he hadn't expected to feel so unmoored by it. For years, he had prepared himself for rejection, for her to want nothing to do with him. What he hadn't prepared for was the possibility that she might demand more than he was capable of giving. As the night wore on, Arthur found himself restless. He reached for the journal he had brought with him, flipping to the entries he had written during his time with Emily. The words were raw, filled with the hopes and fears of a man who had been too young to understand the weight of his choices. One passage caught his eye. "She believes in me in a way no one else ever has. I'm terrified I'll let her down. But if I stay, will I lose myself?" Arthur closed the journal with a sigh. The man who had written those words felt like a stranger, but the consequences of his choices were still all too real. The next morning, Arthur decided to return to the cafe. He wasn't sure if Clara would speak to him, but he knew he couldn't leave things as they were. When he arrived, the cafe was quieter than usual. Clara was at the counter, her movements more subdued than the day before. She glanced up when he entered, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Arthur considered turning back, giving her more time, but then she spoke. "Are you going to sit in the corner and stare again, or do you want to talk?" Arthur smiled faintly, relief flooding through him. He approached the counter, his steps careful, and sat on one of the stools. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to explain. I haven't decided if you deserve one yet," she replied, though her tone lacked the sharpness of the previous day. Arthur nodded. "Fair enough." They spoke tentatively, the conversation punctuated by long silences. Clara asked more questions, about Emily, about Arthur's life after he left, about why it had taken him so long to come back. Arthur answered each one honestly, even when the answers made him uncomfortable. He told her about his fear, his ambition, and the emptiness that had followed his success. He admitted to the nights he had spent wondering what might have been if he had stayed. By the time the cafe began to fill with customers, Clara's demeanor had softened, though her guardedness remained. As Arthur rose to leave, she stopped him. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet. "I want to show you something." Arthur's heart leapt, though he kept his expression neutral. "I'll be here." As he walked back to the inn, the cold wind biting at his face, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, guiding him forward into the unknown. The next morning, Arthur woke with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Clara's invitation the day before had been unexpected, and he spent the hours since wondering what she planned to show him. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were understated, blending into the modest environment of Seabrook. As he tied his shoes, he glanced at the photograph of himself and Emily he had tucked into his bag. It felt like an anchor, grounding him in the reason for this journey. The cafe was already bustling when Arthur arrived, its warmth a welcome contrast to the crisp morning air. Clara was behind the counter, her hair pulled into a simple ponytail, her demeanor focused yet calm. She noticed him immediately, offering a brief nod that was neither inviting nor dismissive. After finishing her shift, Clara approached Arthur's table. "Ready?" she asked, her tone neutral. Arthur nodded, rising to his feet. "Lead the way." They stepped outside, the cold wind brushing against their faces. Clara walked briskly, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, and Arthur followed a step behind. The streets of Seabrook were quiet, save for the occasional passer-by offering a polite nod or greeting. As they walked, Arthur tried to engage her in conversation. "How long have you worked at the cafe?" he asked. "Since I was 16, Clara replied. "It's not glamorous, but it's steady." Arthur nodded, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to ask more, to dive deeper into the life she had built for herself, but her closed demeanor made him hesitate. They reached a modest building near the edge of town, its exterior painted a weathered white. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Seabrook Community Center." Clara opened the door and stepped inside, motioning for Arthur to follow. The interior was warm and inviting, with rows of mismatched chairs arranged in a semicircle and tables stacked with art supplies, books, and board games. A few children ran past, their laughter echoing through the space. Clara waved to a woman behind the counter, who smiled warmly in return. "This is where I spend most of my time," Clara said, her voice softening as she glanced around the room. "It's not just a job, it's a place where people come together." Arthur looked around, taking in the vibrant energy of the center. "You work here?" "I volunteer," Clara said. "We organize activities for kids, support groups, and events for the community. My mom brought me here when I was a kid. She said it was important to give back, no matter how little we had." The mention of Emily sent a pang through Arthur. He could almost picture her here, her hands busy with projects, her voice gentle but firm as she guided others. "She sounds like an incredible woman." "She was," Clara said, her expression softening for the first time. "She taught me everything I know about kindness and strength." Arthur hesitated. "And about me." Clara's face hardened slightly. "She didn't talk about you much." "When I was younger, I'd ask. But she'd always say the same thing, that you were someone who needed to find yourself before you could be found." Arthur swallowed hard. "I wish I'd been braver back then. I wish I hadn't left." Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she moved to a table where a group of children were coloring. She knelt beside them, her presence calming and encouraging. Arthur watched her, a sense of awe building within him. Despite the pain his absence must have caused, Clara had grown into someone remarkable, strong, compassionate, and resilient. After a while, Clara stood and walked back to him. "She never let me hate you," she said quietly, "even when I wanted to. She said holding on to anger would only make things harder for me." Arthur felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away. She was right. Anger has a way of stealing everything else. Clara studied him for a moment, then sighed. Come on, there's one more thing I want to show you. They left the community center and walked a short distance to a small, overgrown garden behind a row of houses. Clara stopped near a weathered bench, gesturing to a patch of earth covered in frost. This was my mom's favorite spot, she said. She used to sit here for hours, writing or reading. She always said it gave her peace. Arthur knelt by the bench, his hand brushing against the frozen ground. She never stopped hoping, did she? Clara's voice was quiet. No. Even when things were hard, she believed people could change. Arthur looked up at her, his voice filled with emotion. I don't deserve this chance, Clara, but I'm going to do everything I can to prove to you that I've changed. Clara's expression softened, though a trace of wariness remained. It's not just about proving it to me, she said. It's about proving it to yourself. Arthur nodded, his resolve strengthening. I'll do whatever it takes. They stood in silence for a moment, the cold wind swirling around them. Arthur felt a strange mixture of pain and hope, as though the pieces of his life were beginning to realign, albeit slowly and imperfectly. Clara, he said finally, thank you for showing me this. It means more than I can say. She nodded, her gaze steady. We'll see if it's enough. As they walked back toward the center of town, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time, he was certain he wanted to see it through. Arthur awoke the next morning to the sound of seagulls outside his window. The light streaming through the curtains was soft and golden, the kind of light that hinted at a fresh start. He dressed quickly, eager to continue what felt like a fragile connection forming between him and Clara. The day before, she had shared pieces of her world with him, and while she remained guarded, Arthur sensed the faintest crack in her armor. He returned to the cafe, as much for its warmth as for the hope of seeing Clara again. When he arrived, the usual hum of morning activity greeted him, coffee machines hissing, dishes clinking, and soft chatter filling the air. Clara was at the counter, her movements efficient, but less hurried than the day before. She noticed him as he approached, her expression a blend of surprise and guarded curiosity. "You're back?" she said simply. Arthur smiled faintly. "I thought I'd make it a habit." Clara raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. She handed him a coffee without asking for his order, and he took a seat by the window, letting the rhythm of the cafe surround him. Not long after, Jack entered. His presence filled the room with an easy confidence, and Arthur couldn't help but notice how Clara's demeanor shifted. She greeted Jack with a genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes, and they exchanged a few words before Jack took a seat at the counter. Arthur watched their interaction, a mixture of curiosity and unease building within him. Jack seemed to occupy a space in Clara's life that Arthur could only dream of. He was a steady presence, someone who clearly knew her well and cared for her deeply. When Clara stepped away to attend to another customer, Jack turned in his seat and caught Arthur's eye. "You must be new in town," he said, his tone friendly but probing. Arthur nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Just passing through." "Seabrook's not much of a tourist destination this time of year," Jack remarked. "What brings you here?" Arthur hesitated. "I'm reconnecting with someone." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. "That right?" Before Arthur could respond, Clara returned to the counter. She glanced between the two men, her brow furrowing slightly. "Jack, leave him alone," she said, her tone light but firm. Jack raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation." Arthur took the opportunity to change the subject. "Clara mentioned the community center yesterday. It seems like an amazing place." Jack nodded, his demeanor softening. "It is." Clara's been a big part of keeping it running. She's got a knack for bringing people together." Arthur glanced at Clara, who busied herself wiping down the counter, avoiding his gaze. "It's clear she's made a real difference." The conversation drifted, but Arthur couldn't shake the tension that lingered between him and Jack. It wasn't overt, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. Jack seemed protective of Clara, and Arthur couldn't blame him. After all, Arthur's sudden appearance in her life must have raised questions and suspicions. As the day wore on, Arthur decided to visit the community center again. He wanted to understand more about the place that had shaped so much of Clara's life. When he arrived, the energy was infectious. Children laughing, volunteers chatting, and the faint strains of music coming from a small activity room. Arthur found Clara in a corner, helping a young boy with an art project. Her focus was entirely on the child, her voice patient and encouraging. Watching her, Arthur felt a pang of both pride and regret. She had grown into someone extraordinary, and he had missed it all. When she noticed him, Clara straightened and approached, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You're persistent," she said, her tone neutral. "I just wanted to see more of what you do here," Arthur replied. "It's impressive." Clara shrugged. "It's not much, but it matters to the people here." "It matters to you," Arthur said softly. Clara's expression flickered, a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "Yeah, it does." Their conversation was interrupted by Jack, who entered carrying a box of supplies. He greeted Clara warmly and then turned to Arthur, his expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you here." Arthur offered a small smile. "I wanted to learn more about the community center." Jack set the box down and crossed his arms. "It's a good place. Clara's poured her heart into it." Arthur nodded, sensing the unspoken challenge in Jack's tone. "She's done incredible work." Clara glanced between the two men, a trace of annoyance flashing across her face. "I don't need you two sizing each other up," she said sharply. "This isn't about either of you." Her words cut through the tension, and Jack looked sheepish. Arthur, too, felt a pang of embarrassment. Clara was right. This wasn't about proving anything to each other. It was about her and the life she had built. Later, as Arthur walked back to the inn, he couldn't help but reflect on the day. The undercurrent of tension with Jack was undeniable, but it was clear he cared deeply for Clara. And while that stirred complicated feelings in Arthur, it also reassured him. Clara had people in her life who supported her, who had been there when he hadn't. Still, Arthur felt a renewed sense of determination. Clara had given him a glimpse of her world, and while he knew earning her trust would take time, he was willing to fight for it. He had spent too long running from the past, and now that he was here, he was prepared to face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant confronting his own shortcomings and the pain he had caused. For the first time in years, Arthur felt like he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly be present. And for Clara, he was determined to stay. The air in Seabrook carried a sharper chill the next morning as Arthur stepped out of the inn. Clouds hung low over the horizon, hinting at an approaching storm, but the small town bustled on, undeterred. Arthur's thoughts were heavy as he made his way toward the cafe, his resolve firm despite the uncertainties that loomed ahead. Clara was behind the counter when he arrived, her movements precise and focused. She glanced at him briefly, but offered no greeting, her expression guarded. Arthur took his usual seat by the window, sensing that today would require even more patience and care than before. As the cafe filled with its regulars, Arthur noticed Jack arrive again, his easy stride and casual charm drawing attention. He greeted Clara with his usual familiarity, their brief exchange warm but efficient. Jack's presence, though friendly on the surface, added an undercurrent of tension for Arthur. Jack had clearly been a consistent part of Clara's life, something Arthur could never claim. When the cafe quieted down, Clara approached Arthur's table with a fresh pot of coffee. She poured silently before speaking, her voice measured. "Are you planning to stick around, or is this just a pit stop?" Arthur met her gaze, the question catching him off guard. "I don't have a timeline," he admitted, "but I'd like to stay as long as you'll let me." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see." Before Arthur could respond, the door jingled, and a man in his late 50s stepped inside. His weathered face broke into a grin when he saw Clara. "Morning, kiddo," he called out. Clara smiled warmly. "Morning, George. Usual?" "You know it," he replied, settling into a seat near the counter. Arthur watched their exchange with curiosity. George's presence seemed to brighten Clara's mood, her posture relaxing as they spoke. He made a mental note of the man, sensing that he was someone Clara trusted. After George left, Arthur took a chance and approached the counter. "That man, he seems close to you." Clara glanced at him, her expression cautious. "George has been around for years. He was one of my mum's closest friends." Arthur nodded, absorbing the information. "I'd like to meet him." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because anyone who meant something to Emily is important to me," Arthur said simply. Clara studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "You're in luck. George volunteers at the community center. If you're serious, you can meet him there." That afternoon, Arthur made his way to the community center, his nerves simmering beneath the surface. He had spent years avoiding the ghosts of his past, and now he was walking directly into a room where they might take shape in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he arrived, the center was alive with activity. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the hum of adult conversations. Arthur spotted George near a table stacked with books, organizing them with a practiced hand. Summoning his courage, Arthur approached. "George?" he asked, his voice steady despite the nerves. The older man looked up, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "That's me, and you are?" "Arthur Kensington," he said, extending a hand. George's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something more guarded. "Kensington," he repeated. "Well, I'll be—" Arthur lowered his hand, unsure if George's hesitation was hostility or simply caution. "Clara said I might find you here." "Did she now?" George replied, setting the books down. "I suppose you're here to talk about Emily." "Yes," Arthur said quietly. I want to know more about her, and about Clara." George's gaze was piercing, as though he could see through Arthur's carefully composed exterior. "You left a big hole when you walked away," he said bluntly. "Emily filled it as best she could, but some things aren't easy to fix." Arthur nodded, the truth of George's words striking deep. "I can't change the past," he admitted, "but I want to be part of their lives now, if they'll let me." George folded his arms, his stance unwavering. "Words are easy, Kensington. What matters is what you do." Arthur felt the weight of the challenge, but didn't shy away. "Then tell me what I can do. Help me understand." For a moment, George said nothing, then he sighed, his expression softening just enough to suggest a flicker of compassion. "You want to help? Stick around. Clara's got a lot on her plate, and the community center could always use an extra pair of hands." Arthur straightened. "I'll do whatever it takes." George nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see if you mean that." Over the next few days, Arthur began volunteering at the community center. The work was humbling, stacking chairs, organizing supplies, and assisting with the children's activities. It was far removed from the boardrooms and luxury events that had once defined his life, but Arthur found a strange satisfaction in the simplicity of it. Clara remained cautious, observing him from a distance, but rarely engaging. George, on the other hand, began to warm to him, offering advice and sharing stories about Emily. Through George, Arthur learned more about the life Emily had built in Seabrook, her struggles, her triumphs, and the unwavering strength she had passed on to Clara. One evening, as they were locking up the center, George turned to Arthur. "You're doing good work here," he said, "but don't think that's enough. Clara's been through a lot. You'll need to show her you're here for the long haul." Arthur nodded, his resolve firm. "I plan to." As he walked back to the inn that night, the cold wind biting at his face, Arthur felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. It was a fragile, tenuous thing, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. For Clara, for Emily, and for himself, he was determined to see this through. The community centre buzzed with its usual energy the next morning, but Arthur felt a quiet tension simmering beneath the surface. Over the past week, his presence in Clara's life had become a fact of her daily routine, though her guardedness remained steadfast. His efforts to prove himself, stacking chairs, running errands, listening intently to the stories of those who had known Emily, were steps forward, but they were small ones. As he walked into the centre, George greeted him with a nod, his hands busy fixing a rickety bookshelf. "Morning, Kensington. You ready to get your hands dirty?" Arthur chuckled lightly. "I think I've gotten used to that." George smirked. "Good. Clara's setting up for the winter fundraiser. Go lend a hand." Arthur found Clara in the main hall, directing a group of volunteers as they hung strings of twinkling lights and arranged tables. She glanced at him when he approached, her expression neutral. "You're late," she said, though her tone lacked its usual edge. "I'm here now," Arthur replied. "What can I do?" She handed him a box filled with decorations. "Start with these. The kids made most of them, so be careful." Arthur nodded, moving to a nearby table to sort through the handmade ornaments. As he worked, Clara drifted closer, her movements unhurried but purposeful. It was the first time they had shared a space without the heavy weight of awkwardness pressing down on them. "George says you've been doing a good job," Clara said suddenly, her voice softer than usual. Arthur looked up, surprised. "That means a lot, coming from him." Clara shrugged. "He doesn't warm to people easily. If he's letting you stick around, that says something." Arthur hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "What about you? Does it mean anything to you?" Clara's hands stilled over a strand of lights she was untangling. She met his gaze briefly, her eyes flickering with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "It's a start." The words were simple, but they hit Arthur like a small victory. He nodded and returned to his work, a faint sense of progress settling over him. That evening, after most of the volunteers had left, Arthur lingered in the hall, helping Clara put away the last of the supplies. The room was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. Clara paused by a table, her hands resting on its edge. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I used to imagine what you were like when I was a kid." Arthur stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. "What did you imagine?" She shrugged, her expression distant. "A lot of things. Sometimes I thought you must have been some kind of hero, someone who left because they were off saving the world. Other times, I thought you just didn't care." Arthur felt a sharp pang in his chest. "I cared," he said softly. "I've always cared. I didn't know how to face it back then." Clara's gaze shifted to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and curiosity. "And now, Arthur said, his voice steady, "I want to be the kind of person you deserve to have in your life, even if it's taken me too long to figure that out." Clara studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see," she said, echoing her earlier sentiment. The following day, Arthur arrived at the community centre to find George waiting for him near the front doors. The older man's expression was serious, his usual easy demeanour replaced with something more thoughtful. "Arthur," George said, motioning him to follow. "There's something you should see." Arthur followed George to a small office tucked away in the corner of the center. Inside, the walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a stack of old notebooks sat on a desk. George picked up one of the notebooks and handed it to Arthur. "What is this?" Arthur asked, flipping through the pages. "Emily kept journals," George said. "She wrote about everything, her dreams, her struggles, and you." Arthur's hands stilled on the notebook, the words blurring on the page. "She wrote about me." "Not often," George admitted, "but when she did, it was always with a sense of hope. She believed you'd come back one day." Arthur felt his throat tighten as he scanned the entries, the words revealing pieces of Emily's heart he had never known. She had written about their time together, her decision to raise Clara on her own, and the strength she had drawn from her daughter's presence. There were moments of pain, but also of forgiveness. One entry caught his attention. "I've spent so many nights wondering if I made the right choice. But when I look at Clara, I know I did. She's my anchor, my reason for everything. And if he ever comes back, I hope he sees what I see, a girl who deserves the world." Arthur closed the notebook, his hands trembling. "She deserved better," he said quietly. George placed a hand on his shoulder. "She made peace with her choices. Arthur, now it's your turn to do the same." Arthur nodded, the weight of Emily's words settling deep within him. As he left the office, the notebook clutched tightly in his hands. He felt both humbled and determined. The journey to repair the damage he had caused was far from over, but with every step, he felt closer to understanding what it meant to truly love and to truly atone. That evening, as Arthur sat in his room at the inn, he opened the notebook again, reading until the words blurred together. Emily's voice, preserved in ink, became a lifeline, a reminder of what he had lost and what he still had a chance to reclaim. The air was heavy with the promise of snow the following morning, the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper. Arthur arrived at the community center early, clutching Emily's journal like a fragile treasure. He had spent the night reading and rereading her words, their honesty cutting through his defenses in ways he hadn't thought possible. Emily had poured her soul onto those pages, her hope, pain, and strength intertwining into a portrait of a woman who had faced life head-on. Today, he knew, was the day to face Clara with what he had learned. Inside the center, the usual bustle of activity greeted him, but Arthur's focus was singular. He found Clara in one of the side rooms, sorting supplies for the winter fundraiser. She glanced up when he entered, her expression neutral but expectant. "You're early," she remarked, setting down a box of decorations. "I needed to talk to you," Arthur said, stepping closer. "Alone." Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. She nodded toward a small table in the corner of the room. "All right." They sat across from each other, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. Arthur placed Emily's journal on the table, his hand resting on its cover. "This belonged to your mother," he began softly. "George gave it to me yesterday." Clara's eyes widened slightly, her gaze flickering to the journal. "Her journal," Arthur nodded. "She wrote about her life, about you, and about me." Clara's expression hardened. "She wrote about you?" "Yes," Arthur admitted. "Not often, but enough to tell me how much she believed in us, even after I left." Clara's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists on the table. "What did she say?" Arthur opened the journal to one of the entries he had marked. His voice trembled as he read aloud. "I know he was scared. I was too. But I always believed there was something good in him, something worth waiting for. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe he'll never come back. But if he does, I hope he knows that forgiveness isn't a weakness. It's a gift." When he finished, Arthur looked up, his throat tight. Clara's face was pale, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stared at the journal as though it were a relic from another world. "She forgave you," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur nodded. "She did, and I don't know if I deserve it, but I want to honor her faith in me." Clara's shoulders shook as she drew a shaky breath. "You left her. You left us. And now you think reading her journal makes it okay?" "No," Arthur said firmly. "It doesn't. Nothing can make up for what I did, but I want to try, Clara, for you, for her." Clara's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of anger and longing. "You think it's that simple? You show up, read a few pages, and suddenly you're part of our lives." Arthur leaned forward, his voice steady. "It's not simple. It's hard and messy, and it'll take time. But I'm here. I'm not running anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of Arthur's words settling between them. Clara looked away, her hands trembling as she picked up the journal. She flipped through its pages, her expression softening as she read. "She always said I was her anchor," Clara murmured, her voice distant, "that I kept her grounded." Arthur's heart ached at the vulnerability in her tone. "You did. And now, maybe we can anchor each other." Clara's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, perhaps, or sincerity. Whatever she saw, it seemed to shift something in her. She closed the journal and pushed it toward him. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to figure out what this means." Arthur nodded, relief and sorrow mingling in his chest. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." Clara stood, her movements deliberate as she picked up the box of decorations. "I've got work to do." Arthur watched her leave, the journal still sitting on the table. He didn't push further, knowing that patience was the only way forward. For now, the fact that she hadn't walked away entirely was enough. That evening, Arthur found himself at the small garden behind the row of houses where Clara had taken him before. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, blanketing the frozen ground. He sat on the weathered bench, the journal open in his lap, and let the stillness seep into him. Emily's words echoed in his mind, their clarity both painful and comforting. For years, he had let fear and regret dictate his life. Now, he realized the only way to truly honor Emily's memory was to face those fears head-on. As the snow continued to fall, Arthur made a silent vow. He would not falter. He would not retreat. For Clara, for Emily, and for himself, he would find a way to bridge the gap he had created. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Arthur felt prepared to walk it, one step at a time. The following days brought a tentative rhythm to Arthur's interactions with Clara. She kept her distance, speaking only when necessary, her words clipped and deliberate. The journal, however, had not left her side. Arthur often caught glimpses of it tucked under her arm or placed carefully on a table as she worked at the community center. It was clear she was reading it, piecing together her own understanding of Emily's life and his place in it. On a crisp afternoon, Arthur arrived at the community center to find the atmosphere charged with energy. The winter fundraiser was only a day away, and the space buzzed with volunteers, arranging decorations, testing lights, and organizing donations. Clara stood at the center of it all, issuing instructions with practiced authority. She caught sight of Arthur and nodded toward a stack of chairs. "Set those up by the stage," she said, her tone brisk. Arthur complied, falling into the rhythm of the preparations. The fundraiser was clearly important to Clara, and he wanted to support her in any way he could. As the hours passed, the center transformed into a festive haven, its modest halls adorned with twinkling lights and handmade decorations. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the volunteers trickled out, leaving only a handful of people behind. Arthur found himself stacking unused supplies in a storage closet when he heard a familiar voice behind him. You really think you can just slide back into her life? Arthur turned to see Jack standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression cold. The easy charm Jack had displayed in the cafe was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made Arthur uneasy. "I'm not trying to slide anywhere," Arthur said evenly. "I'm trying to make amends," Jack scoffed. "Amends after 25 years? Do you have any idea what Clara's been through, what Emily went through?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "No, I don't. But I'm here to learn, to do what I can to make things right." Jack stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You don't get to make things right just because you decided to show up. Clara doesn't need you. She's done fine without you." Arthur met Jack's gaze, his voice steady. "I know she doesn't need me, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try to be part of her life." Jack's expression darkened. "She's better off without you messing things up again." Before Arthur could respond, Clara's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Both men turned to see her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing. She stepped into the room, her gaze flicking between them. "Jack, I appreciate everything you've done for me," she said, her tone measured but firm. "But this isn't your fight." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Clara held up a hand. "No, this is between me and him." Jack hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Fine. But don't let him hurt you again, Clara." With that, he turned and left the room, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Clara watched him go before turning back to Arthur, her expression unreadable. "I don't need you two butting heads over me," she said sharply. "I can handle my own life." Arthur nodded. "I wasn't trying to fight with him, but I won't apologize for being here." Clara stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Jack's protective. He's been there for me when no one else was." "I can see that," Arthur said quietly, "and I'm grateful he's been in your life." Clara's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. "You're not going to win him over, you know." Arthur allowed himself a faint smile. "I'm not here to win him over. I'm here for you." Clara looked away, her gaze settling on the stack of decorations beside the door. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I've been reading her journal. It's a lot." Arthur stepped closer, his movements careful. "It is. She was an extraordinary woman." "She was," Clara agreed, her voice tight, "and she deserved better." Arthur felt the weight of her words, but he didn't flinch. "She did, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life, but I want to be better now, for her and for you." Clara turned back to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "It's not that simple, Arthur. You can't just walk back into my life and expect me to trust you." "I don't expect you to trust me," Arthur said softly, "but I'm willing to earn it, no matter how long it takes." Clara studied him, her expression flickering between doubt and something more vulnerable. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "We'll see." It wasn't much, but it was enough. As Clara walked away, Arthur felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was truly walking towards something that mattered. That night, as the snow began to fall once again, Arthur sat alone in his room, Emily's journal resting on the desk in front of him. He opened it to one of the final entries, the words blurring slightly as emotions swelled in his chest. "Life doesn't wait for us to figure it out. It keeps moving, pushing us forward, whether we're ready or not. But maybe that's the beauty of it. Every step, no matter how painful, is a chance to begin again." Arthur closed the journal, his resolve hardening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face them. For Clara, for Emily's memory, and for himself, he was determined to keep moving forward. The morning of the fundraiser arrived with a fresh coat of snow, blanketing Seabrook, softening the edges of the small town and giving it an almost magical stillness. The community center, however, was anything but quiet. Volunteers bustled about, carrying boxes, arranging tables, and adjusting strings of lights that twinkled like stars. The energy in the air was infectious, and Arthur felt himself swept up in the momentum. When he arrived, Clara was already in full command of the preparations. She moved from task to task with efficiency, her sharp eyes catching every detail that needed adjustment. Arthur paused for a moment, watching her with a mixture of pride and awe. Despite the guardedness she still held toward him, she was clearly in her element, and it was impossible not to admire her dedication. Clara noticed him and gestured toward a stack of supplies. "Those go near the stage," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. Arthur nodded and got to work, finding small satisfaction in contributing to the event she cared so much about. As the hours passed, the center transformed into a winter wonderland. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, hand-painted signs welcomed guests, and tables were adorned with simple but elegant decorations. By late afternoon, the fundraiser was ready. Families began to arrive, their laughter and chatter filling the hall. There were games for the children, a raffle table, and a modest stage where a local band tuned their instruments. Arthur found himself caught up in conversations with townsfolk, many of whom spoke warmly of Emily and Clara. "She's just like her mother," one older woman said, her smile wistful as she watched Clara interact with a group of children. "Strong, kind, and determined," Arthur nodded, his chest tightening. "She's remarkable," he agreed. As the evening progressed, Arthur noticed Jack arrive. He exchanged a brief glance with Arthur but didn't approach. Instead, focusing on helping Clara with the raffle tickets, Arthur respected the boundary, knowing Jack's presence in Clara's life was an integral one, even if it wasn't easy to navigate. Toward the end of the evening, Clara took the stage to address the crowd. She stood tall, her voice clear and confident as she thanked everyone for their support and outlined the ways the funds would benefit the community center. Arthur watched her with a mixture of pride and regret, his thoughts returning to Emily and the strength she must have poured into raising Clara alone. As the crowd applauded, Clara stepped off the stage and made her way toward him. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for helping today," she said quietly. Arthur smiled. "You didn't need my help, but I was happy to be here." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "It went better than I expected," she admitted. "You've built something incredible here," Arthur said. "Emily would be so proud." Clara's gaze flickered, her guard rising slightly at the mention of her mother. "It's not just me. A lot of people helped make this happen." "Maybe," Arthur said gently, "but you're the one who held it all together." Clara didn't respond immediately. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "She always told me to find something worth fighting for. I guess this became that for me." Arthur felt a pang of both admiration and sorrow. She was wise. Clara nodded, then glanced toward the stage where the band was packing up their instruments. "There's one more thing I want to show you." Curious, Arthur followed her out of the hall and into the quiet night. She led him down a narrow path to a small garden tucked behind the center, its snow-covered ground glittering under the soft glow of string lights. In the middle of the garden stood a simple stone bench, and next to it, a plaque embedded in the earth. Arthur knelt to read the inscription, his breath catching as he did. "In memory of Emily Walker, a heart as strong as the sea, a love as vast as the sky." "She built this garden," Clara said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was her sanctuary. When she passed, we decided to dedicate it to her." Arthur's hands trembled as he touched the plaque. "She deserved this," he said quietly, "and so much more." Clara crossed her arms, her gaze distant. "I used to come here all the time after she died. I felt closer to her here than anywhere else." Arthur stood, his throat tight. "Thank you for showing me this." Clara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but if you're serious about being part of my life, you need to understand who she was, what she meant to me." "I do," Arthur said, his voice firm. "And I want to honor her memory by being here for you, in whatever way you'll let me." Clara's eyes searched his face, as though weighing his words. Then, with a small nod, she said, "We'll see." It was the same cautious refrain she had used before, but this time it carried a note of possibility. As they walked back toward the center, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel in years, a fragile, tentative sense of belonging. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he believed it was a road worth traveling. The next morning, Seabrook woke to a relentless storm. Snow fell in heavy sheets, muffling the town under a blanket of white. The roads were quiet, the usual hum of activity stilled by the weather. Arthur sat in his small room at the inn, watching the snow swirl outside the window. He thought of the garden Clara had shown him the night before, its simple beauty now buried under layers of frost. The fundraiser had been a step forward, but Clara's guardedness lingered. She had let him into her world, piece by piece, but trust was still a distant goal. Arthur knew he needed to show her that he was committed, not just in words, but in actions. That afternoon, he ventured to the community center, undeterred by the storm. The building was quieter than usual, most of the volunteers having stayed home. Inside, the air was warm, but the energy was subdued. Clara sat at a table near the front, sorting through the leftover decorations from the fundraiser. Her expression was focused, but her movements were slower than usual, as if the weight of the past weeks was finally catching up to her. Arthur approached cautiously. "I didn't expect you to be here today." Clara looked up, her eyes tired but sharp. "There's always work to do." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, watching as she untangled a strand of lights. "You've done so much for this place, for this town." She shrugged, not looking up. "It's what my mom would have wanted." "Emily would be proud of you," Arthur said softly. "You've built something incredible here." Clara's hands stilled, the lights dangling from her fingers. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "You keep saying that, but you didn't know her like I did." Arthur leaned forward, his voice steady. "No, I didn't, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I want to know her through you, through what she left behind." Clara sighed, setting the lights aside. "You keep asking to be part of my life, but you don't understand what it's been like. Growing up knowing you were out there, but you weren't here. Watching my mom do everything on her own, wondering if you even thought about us." Arthur's chest tightened. "I thought about you every day," he admitted, "but I was too much of a coward to come back. I let my fear and my pride get in the way." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening. "Do you have any idea what that did to her? To me?" Arthur's voice broke as he answered, "I don't, but I want to. Tell me, Clara, tell me what I need to understand." For a moment, she said nothing. Then, her voice trembling, she began to speak. She told him about the nights when Emily would sit at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, worrying about how to make ends meet. She described the times she had asked about him as a child, only to see her mother's face cloud with sadness. She spoke of the loneliness, the anger, the questions that had haunted her for years. Arthur listened in silence, his heart breaking with every word. He had spent decades imagining the pain his absence might have caused, but hearing it from Clara was almost unbearable. When she finished, her hands were trembling and her voice was raw. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Clara said, her eyes locking onto his, "but I'm trying for her." Arthur's throat tightened, but he nodded. "That's all I can ask." The room fell silent, the storm outside providing a steady rhythm to their thoughts. After a long pause, Clara reached for the journal she had kept close since George had given it to her. She placed it on the table between them, her fingers tracing its worn cover. "She forgave you," Clara said softly. "Even after everything, she still believed in you." Arthur looked down at the journal, his vision blurring. "She was stronger than I ever deserved." Clara studied him for a moment, then pushed the journal toward him. "There's one entry you should read. It's from the last year of her life." Arthur hesitated, then opened the journal to the marked page. Emily's handwriting filled the page, her words steady and deliberate. "Clara is my light, my reason. She's everything good in this world. I only wish Arthur could see her, could know her the way I do. If he ever comes back, I hope she gives him a chance. Not for him, but for herself. Because forgiveness isn't just about letting go. It's about finding peace." Arthur's hands trembled as he read the words. He closed the journal carefully, his heart heavy with a mixture of grief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what this means for us," she said, "but I'm not ready to give up on finding out." Arthur's chest ached with emotion, but he managed a faint smile. "Neither am I." As the storm continued to rage outside, Arthur and Clara sat in the quiet warmth of the community center, their shared pain and tentative hope forming the fragile beginnings of something new. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. The storm passed overnight, leaving Seabrook draped in a pristine blanket of snow. The town stirred slowly that morning, the streets quiet under a pale winter sky. Arthur arrived at the community center early, hoping to continue the tentative progress he had made with Clara. She had begun to lower her guard piece by piece, and though the path forward was fragile, it was one Arthur was determined to tread. Inside, the warmth of the center greeted him, its halls bustling with activity as volunteers sorted through donations from the fundraiser. Arthur spotted Clara in the main room, her head bent over a clipboard as she directed a group of volunteers. She looked up when she saw him, her expression neutral but not cold. "Morning," Arthur said as he approached. "Morning," Clara replied, glancing back at her clipboard. "We're short a few hands in the storage room. Can you help?" "Of course," Arthur said. He followed her instructions, working alongside a group of volunteers to organize supplies. The mundane task gave him time to reflect on the journal entry Clara had shared with him the previous day. Emily's words had stayed with him through the night, their quiet strength both humbling and motivating. As he worked, Arthur overheard snippets of conversation between the volunteers. Most were light-hearted, but one comment froze him in place. "Did you hear about Clara's dad?" a young woman whispered to her friend. "He just showed up out of nowhere. Must be nice to disappear for decades and waltz back like nothing happened." Arthur's grip on the box he was holding tightened, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The weight of their judgment was something he had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud still stung. Later that afternoon, Arthur found himself alone in one of the smaller rooms of the center, tidying up leftover decorations. The quiet was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and he turned to see Jack standing in the doorway. "You've been busy," Jack said, his tone guarded. Arthur straightened, meeting Jack's gaze. "There's plenty to do." Jack stepped into the room, crossing his arms. "You think this changes anything showing up pitching in, reading Emily's journal. Arthur sighed, setting down the box he was holding. No, I don't. But it's a start. Jack's expression darkened. Clara doesn't need you to swoop in and try to fix things. She's done fine without you. I know she has, Arthur said evenly, and I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to be part of her life if she'll let me. Jack's jaw tightened. You don't get to just decide that. You walked away. You gave up your place in her life. Arthur's chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm. You're right. I did. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't try now. Jack shook his head, his frustration evident. You think this is about you making peace with your guilt. Clara doesn't need you to atone for the past. She needs people who've been here, who've stayed. Arthur took a step closer, his voice firm. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a clean slate. I'm asking for a chance to show her that I'm not the man I was. Before Jack could respond, Clara's voice cut through the tension. What's going on? Both men turned to see her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Just a conversation, Arthur said quickly. Clara's gaze shifted between them, her eyes narrowing. Doesn't look like just a conversation. Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I'm just trying to look out for you. I don't need you to fight my battles, Clara said, her tone sharper than Arthur had ever heard. This isn't about you, Jack. Jack flinched, his expression softening. Clara, I just don't want to see you get hurt. Clara sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. I know, but I can handle this. Jack hesitated, then nodded, his frustration giving way to resignation. He glanced at Arthur one last time before leaving the room. When they were alone, Clara turned to Arthur, her eyes searching his face. What was that about? Arthur hesitated. Jack's protective of you. He has every right to be. Clara nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. He's been there for me through a lot. But sometimes he forgets that I can make my own decisions. Arthur allowed himself a faint smile. I'm starting to see where you get your strength. Clara looked away, her voice quiet. It's not always easy, letting people in. After my mom, I learned to rely on myself. I understand, Arthur said softly. But you don't have to do it all alone. She turned back to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. We'll see. It was the same refrain she had offered before, but this time it felt like a step forward. As Clara left the room, Arthur stood in the quiet, the weight of the encounter settling over him. The road ahead remained fraught with challenges, but for the first time he felt like he was beginning to earn his place in Clara's life, not by erasing the past, but by proving himself in the present. The wind howled outside the community center the following evening, a biting reminder of the winter's persistence. Inside, the air was warm and lively, though a thread of tension wove through the usual hum of activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly to prepare for an upcoming community dinner, their chatter filling the space. Arthur moved quietly among them, carrying trays and setting tables, content to be part of the background. Clara was at the center of it all, her focus unwavering as she directed the team. Her efficiency was matched only by her sharpness, and though she maintained her usual guarded distance from Arthur, there were moments, fleeting glances, softer tones, where he sensed her resolve beginning to waver. As the evening progressed, George arrived, his presence immediately grounding the room. He greeted Arthur with a firm handshake and a knowing smile. Still sticking around, I see. I'm not going anywhere, Arthur replied. George nodded approvingly. Good. Clara's stubborn, but she notices more than she lets on. Arthur glanced toward Clara, who was deep in conversation with one of the volunteers. She's been through so much. I don't blame her for being cautious. Cautious is an understatement, George said with a chuckle, but that's her strength. And maybe, if you're patient, it'll be her way of letting you in. Later that evening, after most of the volunteers had gone home, Arthur lingered in the main hall, tidying up stray decorations. The community center was quiet now, the echo of earlier conversations replaced by the soft hum of the heating system. Clara was still there, sorting through paperwork at a table near the front of the room. Arthur hesitated, then approached, his steps cautious. "Need any help?" Clara looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'm almost done." He stood for a moment, uncertain whether to leave or stay. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You've built something incredible here," he said. "This community depends on you." Clara shrugged, her focus still on the papers in front of her. "It's not just me. It's everyone who shows up, who cares." "But it starts with someone," Arthur pressed gently. "And that someone is you." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, but she didn't look up. "It was my mom's dream first. I just kept it going." Arthur leaned forward, his voice soft. "You've done more than that. You've turned it into something she'd be proud of." Clara finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "It's hard to believe you when you didn't even know her." "I'm trying to," Arthur said earnestly, "through you, through her journal, through the people who loved her." Clara sat back, crossing her arms. "And what do you think you've learned?" Arthur hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "That she was strong, that she loved fiercely, and that she never stopped believing in second chances." Clara's expression flickered, a mixture of pain and something softer. "She did, even when she shouldn't have." Arthur leaned closer, his voice steady. "She wasn't wrong to believe in you, or in me. And I'm here to prove that." Clara looked away, her fingers drumming against the table. "It's not that simple, Arthur." "I know," he said, "but I'm willing to take the time, to do the work. For you, for her." Silence hung between them for a long moment before Clara spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I've been reading her journal again. There's a part where she wrote about you, about how she wished I could meet you one day. She said you were flawed but not hopeless." Arthur swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "She was kinder to me than I ever deserved." Clara's gaze softened slightly. "She saw the best in people, sometimes even when they didn't see it themselves." Arthur nodded, his voice thick. "I want to live up to that, to honor her faith in me." Clara studied him for a long moment before sighing. "We'll see." It was the same refrain, but this time it carried less resistance and more possibility. Arthur felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The next day, Arthur found himself alone in the garden behind the community center. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen earth and the first hints of green. He sat on the weathered bench near the plaque dedicated to Emily, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the past and the tenuous threads of the present. George appeared, his steady presence grounding as always. He took a seat beside Arthur, his hands resting on his knees. "She's coming around, you know." Arthur glanced at him, skeptical. "You think so?" George nodded. "Clara's not the type to say things she doesn't mean. If she's letting you stay, it's because she sees something." Arthur exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I just want to be the father she deserves." George smiled faintly. "Then keep showing up. That's half the battle." They sat in silence for a while, the stillness of the garden enveloping them. As Arthur gazed at the plaque, Emily's words from the journal echoed in his mind. Forgiveness isn't just about letting go. It's about finding peace. For the first time, Arthur felt like he was beginning to understand what that meant. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but for Clara, for Emily's memory, and for himself, He was ready to keep walking it, one step at a time. The following morning dawned bright and cold, the sun glinting off the snow-covered rooftops of Seabrook. Arthur arrived at the community center early, his breath visible in the frigid air. Inside, the volunteers had begun preparations for the upcoming spring events, even as the last traces of winter lingered outside. Arthur found Clara in the main hall, bent over a table covered in posters and flyers. Her focus was sharp, her movements deliberate, but there was a subtle tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. He hesitated, then approached cautiously. "Good morning," he said, his tone light. Clara glanced up briefly before returning to her work. "Morning. Anything I can do to help?" he offered. She gestured toward a stack of chairs near the corner. "Those need to be set up for the planning meeting." Arthur nodded and got to work, falling into the rhythm of the center's daily hum. He was used to the quiet tension between them, but today it felt different, less like a barrier and more like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. As the morning wore on, the volunteers began to gather for the meeting. George arrived, his steady presence as reassuring as ever, and Jack followed not long after, his expression guarded but polite. Arthur caught Jack's eye and nodded, a silent truce hanging between them. The meeting began, Clara leading with her usual efficiency. She outlined plans for upcoming community programs, her voice calm but commanding. Arthur listened intently, impressed once again by her leadership. She had inherited Emily's strength, but she had forged her own path with it. Toward the end of the meeting, Clara paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Before we finish, I want to thank everyone for their continued support. This place wouldn't exist without you." The group murmured their agreement, and Clara's eyes briefly met Arthur's. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried a weight that left him hopeful. After the meeting, most of the volunteers dispersed, leaving only Clara, George, and Arthur to tidy up. As Arthur stacked chairs, he noticed Clara lingering near the table where the flyers were spread out. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a poster. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "You seem distracted today," he said gently. Clara glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Just a lot on my mind. Anything I can help with?" Arthur asked. She hesitated, then sighed. "Jack's been pushing me to take a break, to step back from the center for a while." Arthur frowned. "Do you think he's right?" Clara shrugged. "I don't know. This place has been my whole life since my mom. I don't know who I am without it." Arthur's chest tightened at her words. "You're more than this place, Clara. What you've built here is incredible, but it doesn't define you." Clara looked away, her voice quieter. "Maybe, but it's hard to let go, even for a little while." Arthur stepped closer, his voice steady. "Sometimes stepping back isn't about letting go. It's about finding perspective. Your mum taught you to fight for what matters, but she also wanted you to live your life." Clara's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes sharp. "Don't tell me what my mom wanted." Arthur held up his hands, his voice calm. I'm just saying that you deserve to find your own path, just like she did." For a moment, Clara said nothing. Then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't know how to do that." Arthur hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Maybe it starts with trusting the people around you, letting them carry some of the weight." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I'll think about it." It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something. As they finished cleaning up, Arthur felt a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent. That evening, as Arthur walked back to the inn, he found himself reflecting on Clara's words. Her struggle to let go, even temporarily, was a mirror of his own inability to forgive himself. They were both fighting battles that ran deeper than the surface, battles that would take time to overcome. When he reached his room, he opened Emily's journal and read one of the entries he hadn't yet touched. Clara's heart is as strong as her mind, but sometimes I worry she carries too much. I hope she learns that strength doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means letting others in. Arthur closed the journal, his chest tight with emotion. Emily's wisdom continued to guide him, even now. She had seen Clara's potential long before anyone else, and her words reminded him of the delicate balance he needed to strike, supporting Clara without overstepping, offering guidance without demanding trust. As the snow began to fall again, Arthur made a silent promise to himself. He would be there for Clara, not just as a father trying to atone, but as someone willing to share in her struggles, to lighten the load she had carried for so long. Together, perhaps they could find the peace Emily had always hoped for. The snow had finally begun to melt, revealing patches of earth and concrete beneath the white blanket that had covered Seabrook for weeks. The town, slowly waking from its winter hibernation, buzzed with renewed energy. Arthur walked briskly toward the community center, carrying a bag of donated supplies he had promised to deliver. The air smelled of thawing soil and a hint of salt from the nearby sea, a reminder of the cycles of change that had quietly unfolded around him. Inside the center, the warmth was welcoming. Volunteers bustled about, reorganizing after the long winter, their chatter echoing off the high ceilings. Clara stood near the front, directing a group of children assembling spring decorations. She laughed softly at one of their jokes, her face momentarily lit with the kind of joy Arthur had rarely seen in her. He lingered for a moment, unwilling to interrupt the rare glimpse of her unguarded self. When she noticed him, her smile faded slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. "You're early," she said, her tone lighter than usual. "Thought I'd help with the restocking," Arthur replied, holding up the bag. Clara nodded toward a table piled high with supplies. "Put them there. We'll sort them later." Arthur set the bag down and joined her near the children's craft station. She was showing a young girl how to cut out paper flowers, her movements patient and deliberate. The girl giggled as Clara gently corrected her grip on the scissors. "You're good at this," Arthur remarked. Clara shrugged, her focus still on the child. "Kids are easy. They don't expect too much." Arthur hesitated, then said softly, "Neither do I." Clara stiffened slightly but didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the children, guiding them as they worked. Arthur watched her, marveling at the strength and compassion she had inherited from Emily. He couldn't help but wonder how much of that resilience had been born from necessity, forged in the absence he had left behind. Later that afternoon, after the children had gone home, Clara sat in the office sorting through a stack of paperwork. Arthur knocked softly on the open door, and she glanced up, her expression wary but not closed off. "Can I come in?" he asked. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sure." Arthur sat, his hands resting on his knees. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about not knowing who you are without the center." Clara didn't look up from her papers. "It's not that complicated. This place has always been my anchor." "But anchors can weigh you down," Arthur said gently. "You deserve to find what makes you happy outside of this place." Clara set down her pen and looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And what if I don't know what that is?" Arthur hesitated, then said, "Maybe it's time to find out." Clara frowned, her guard rising again. "And what would you know about it? You spent your whole life running from things." The words stung, but Arthur nodded. "I did, and it's one of my biggest regrets. But I also know that running isn't the answer. Neither is staying in one place because it feels safe." Clara leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I'm not running. I'm building something that matters." "I know," Arthur said quickly, "and what you've built here is extraordinary. But your mom didn't just want you to build something, she wanted you to live. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Don't tell me what my mom wanted. Arthur leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She wrote it, Clara, in her journal. She wanted you to find your own path, to let people in, to let yourself be happy. Clara's breath hitched, and she looked away. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the heater. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. She always made it look so easy, balancing everything, keeping it together. I don't know how to do that. Arthur's heart ached at the vulnerability in her words. You don't have to do it alone, he said softly. That's what she wanted you to understand. Clara turned back to him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. And what about you? What do you want? Arthur hesitated, then said, I want to be here for you, to be someone you can count on, even if it takes the rest of my life to prove it. Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. We'll see. It was the same cautious refrain, but this time it carried the faintest hint of hope. Arthur felt his chest tighten, a mixture of relief and determination filling him. He wasn't there yet, but he was closer than he had been. That evening, as Arthur walked back to the inn, he felt the weight of the day settle over him. Clara's words echoed in his mind, her guardedness a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. But her tentative acceptance, however small, was enough to keep him moving forward. Inside his room, he opened Emily's journal and read another entry. Clara is my heart, my joy, my reason. I want her to know that she's not alone, that she's loved. If Arthur ever finds his way back, I hope he tells her that too. Arthur closed the journal, his throat tight. For the first time, he felt the weight of Emily's forgiveness lift slightly, replaced by a quiet certainty. He couldn't change the past, but he could honor her memory by being the father Clara deserved, and the man Emily had always believed he could be. The soft glow of spring sunlight filtered through the windows of the community center, casting long beams across the polished floor. Arthur arrived early that morning, drawn by a restless energy he couldn't quite place. Each day brought him closer to understanding Clara's world and the remarkable person she had become, but it also deepened his awareness of the distance he still had to bridge. Clara was already there, organizing a group of children at the craft tables. Her voice, calm yet commanding, guided them as they worked on colorful paper garlands. Arthur paused in the doorway, watching her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that reminded him of Emily, yet there was a resolute independence that was entirely her own. When Clara noticed him, she gave a small nod. "You're early." Arthur smiled faintly. "Wanted to get a head start." "Good," Clara said, gesturing toward a table covered in supplies. "We've got plenty to do." Arthur moved to the table, falling into the rhythm of the morning. As they worked side by side, their interactions were marked by a tentative ease. It wasn't quite comfortable, but it wasn't strained either, a fragile middle ground that Arthur cherished. As the morning wore on and the children began to leave, Clara approached him. "We're short a few volunteers for the food drive tomorrow," she said. "Think you're up for it?" "Of course," Arthur replied without hesitation. Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "Be here by 8. "It's an all-day thing." "I'll be here," Arthur promised. That evening, as Arthur walked through the quiet streets of Seabrook, he found himself reflecting on the small shifts in his relationship with Clara. Her guardedness remained, but there were moments, brief, fleeting, when it felt like she was letting him in. He stopped by the garden Clara had shown him weeks earlier, now fully thawed and beginning to bloom. The plaque dedicated to Emily gleamed softly in the fading light, Arthur knelt by it, his fingers brushing against the etched words. "Emily," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm trying. I hope you can see that." As the evening air grew cooler, Arthur sat on the bench, lost in thought. He was pulled from his reverie by the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw Clara approaching, her hands in her coat pockets. She stopped a few feet away, her expression curious. "I didn't think anyone else came here this late," she said. Arthur stood, brushing snow from his coat. "I find it comforting." Clara nodded, her gaze shifting to the garden. "It's always been my favorite place. Quiet. Safe." They stood in silence for a moment, the stillness between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You've been spending a lot of time here," Clara said, her tone soft but questioning. Arthur hesitated, then said, "It helps me feel closer to her. To understand what I missed." Clara's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Sadness, perhaps, or understanding. "She believed in second chances," she said quietly. Arthur's chest tightened at her words. "Do you?" Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know, but I'm trying." The honesty in her voice cut through him, leaving him both humbled and hopeful. He nodded, his voice steady. "That's all I can ask." The next day, Arthur arrived at the community center early, ready for the food drive. The hall buzzed with activity as volunteers packed boxes, organized supplies, and loaded trucks. Clara moved through the crowd with her usual efficiency, her sharp eye catching every detail. Arthur worked steadily, his focus on the task at hand. As the day wore on, he found himself paired with Clara to deliver boxes to a nearby shelter. The two of them loaded the truck in relative silence, the hum of the engine filling the gaps where words might have been. When they arrived at the shelter, Clara directed the volunteers as they unloaded the supplies. Arthur followed her lead, marveling at her ability to command respect and inspire action. She was a force, and he felt honored to witness it. As they finished unloading, Clara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You're good at this," Arthur smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." Clara raised an eyebrow. "George." Arthur shook his head. "Your mother." Her gaze softened, and for a moment she looked as though she might respond, but instead she turned away, her voice quiet. "Let's get back." The ride back to the community center was quiet, but not tense. Clara seemed lost in thought, and Arthur didn't press her. He was learning to let her set the pace, to let her decide when and how to open up. That evening, as they finished cleaning up from the day's work, Clara approached Arthur near the storage room. She hesitated, her hands tucked into her pockets. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "for helping today." Arthur smiled, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. "It was my pleasure." Clara nodded, then added softly, "And for not giving up on this, on me." Arthur's breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it was steady and full of emotion. "I never will." Clara held his gaze for a long moment before nodding again, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We'll see." This time, her words carried a warmth that made Arthur feel, for the first time, that forgiveness might truly be within reach. As they locked up the center and stepped out into the cool night air, Arthur felt a quiet hope bloom within him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he truly believed they were walking it together. The days lengthened as spring took hold of Seabrook. Trees began to bud, and the streets filled with the scent of thawing earth and the faint promise of blossoms. The community center thrived, its halls echoing with laughter and chatter as new programs unfolded. Arthur had become a familiar face there. his presence no longer a surprise, but a quiet constant. Despite the progress, shadows of the past lingered. Clara was warmer now, her guardedness softening in small but significant ways, yet there were moments when her eyes held a distant sadness Arthur couldn't ignore. He understood that forgiveness was a fragile thing, not easily given nor quickly earned. One evening, as Arthur was tidying up after an art class, George found him in the storage room. The older man leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way," George said. Arthur paused, a stack of paintbrushes in his hands. "Thanks to you, and to Clara." George nodded, stepping into the room. "She's letting you in. Slowly, but she is." "I know," Arthur replied, "but there's still a lot I don't understand, a lot I missed." George tilted his head, his gaze steady. "What's weighing on you?" Arthur hesitated, then sighed. "Clara carries something. Pain, maybe regret. I can see it in her, even when she's laughing. I don't know if it's because of me or something else." George's face grew serious. He leaned closer, his voice quieter. "There's something she's never talked much about, not with me, not with anyone." Arthur frowned, his heart tightening. "What is it?" George hesitated, then shook his head. "It's not my story to tell, but if you want to understand, you need to ask her. Just be ready for what you hear." The next day, Arthur found Clara in the garden behind the community center. She was kneeling by a patch of soil, planting bright spring flowers. The sight of her, so focused and intent, reminded Arthur of the first time she had brought him here. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Looks like you've been busy." Clara glanced up, brushing dirt from her hands. "It needed some color." Arthur nodded, sitting on the edge of the weathered bench. For a moment, they worked in silence, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic filling the space between them. "Clara," Arthur said finally, his voice tentative, "can I ask you something?" She paused, her hands stilling in the soil. "What?" Arthur hesitated, then said, "George mentioned that there's something you don't talk about. I don't want to pry, but if it's something that weighs on you, I want to understand." Clara's face tightened, her expression guarded once more. George shouldn't have said anything. "He didn't tell me what it was," Arthur said quickly. "He just thought it might help if I knew." Clara sat back on her heels, her hands resting in her lap. For a long moment, she stared at the ground, her brow furrowed. Then she exhaled sharply and looked at him. "It's about my mom," she said, her voice low, "and the last year of her life." Arthur's chest tightened. "What happened?" Clara's gaze was distant, her voice trembling slightly. "She got sick. Cancer. She didn't tell me at first, didn't tell anyone. By the time I found out, it was too late. She didn't want to burden me, but it was the hardest thing I've ever been through." Arthur felt the weight of her words, a sharp pang of guilt and sorrow piercing his chest. "Clara, She was so strong," Clara continued, her voice breaking. "Even when she was in pain, she was thinking about everyone else. About me, about the center. I tried to be there for her, but I couldn't save her." Tears welled in her eyes, and she wiped them away angrily. She deserved better. Arthur's voice was thick with emotion. She deserved everything, and I should have been there. Clara shook her head, her hands trembling. "It's not just about you, Arthur. I've spent years trying to make up for not doing enough, for not being enough." Arthur leaned forward, his heart aching. "Clara, you were everything to her. She wrote it in her journal, how proud she was of you, how much she loved you. She never thought you weren't enough." Clara's shoulders shook as she drew a ragged breath. "I just miss her." Arthur reached out, hesitating before placing a hand on hers. "I do too," he said softly. Even though I didn't know her as well as I should have, I miss her every day. Clara didn't pull away, her gaze fixed on the soil. She believed in forgiveness, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes it's hard to forgive yourself. Arthur's grip tightened on her hand. Then let's figure it out together. For her. Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears but also a flicker of something else. Hope. We'll see, she said, her voice wavering. Arthur nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It was the same refrain, but it carried more weight now, more promise. For the first time, he felt like they were truly beginning to share the burden of their pain. As they sat in the quiet garden, the shadows of the past seemed to lift just slightly, leaving room for something new to grow. The road ahead was still long, but together they had taken an important step toward healing and toward each other. The days following Clara's confession carried a tentative, fragile truce between her and Arthur. The community center bustled with activity as spring events unfolded, yet their shared moments felt quieter, more introspective. Arthur worked steadily, taking on tasks with a quiet determination, while Clara seemed less guarded, her sharp edges softening in small, imperceptible ways. One morning, Clara approached Arthur as he was sorting through boxes in the storage room. She stood in the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "We need to make a supply run," she said simply. "Thought you might want to come." Arthur straightened, surprised but pleased. Of course. The drive to the neighboring town was unremarkable, the kind of routine errand that might have felt ordinary if not for the significance of Clara inviting him along. She drove in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly in the background. Arthur occasionally glanced at her, noting the way her focus on the road seemed to calm her. At the supply store, they worked efficiently, loading the car with bags of donated clothing and boxes of food. As they packed the last of the items into the trunk, Clara leaned against the car, her gaze distant. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked suddenly. Arthur paused, her question catching him off guard. "All the time," he admitted. "There are days when I can't help but wonder how different things would be if I'd stayed." Clara nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I used to think about it too. When I was younger, I'd imagine what it would have been like to have you there. Birthdays, school events, even just having someone to talk to." Arthur's chest tightened, guilt and regret flooding him. "I'm sorry, Clara, for all of it. I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about showing up now, it's about proving that you're staying." "I know," Arthur said softly, "and I will, no matter how long it takes." Clara's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "We'll see." Her words, familiar yet different, carried a subtle warmth that gave Arthur hope. That evening, Clara invited Arthur to dinner at her home, a modest but cozy cottage near the center of town. The space was filled with personal touches, photos of her mother, framed artwork from the community center, and a bookshelf overflowing with well-worn novels. Arthur helped set the table as Clara prepared a simple meal. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs filled the air, mingling with the faint crackle of the fireplace. They ate in companionable silence, the clink of cutlery, the only sound for a while. After dinner, Clara brought out a box of old photographs. She placed it on the table between them, her movements hesitant. "I thought you might want to see these," she said quietly. "They're mostly of my mom and me, but there are a few of you too." Arthur's breath caught as Clara opened the box, revealing a collection of snapshots that spanned years. He picked up a photo of a young Emily holding a baby Clara, her smile radiant despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "She was beautiful," Arthur murmured. Clara nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She was, and strong. I don't think I ever really understood how much until she was gone. Arthur sifted through the photos, his heart aching with each memory he had missed. There was Clara's first day of school, her proud grin framed by a bright red backpack. Another showed her and Emily building a snowman, their laughter frozen in time. As he reached the bottom of the stack, he found a photo of himself and Emily, taken during their brief time together. They were sitting on a park bench, their hands intertwined, their smiles shy but full of promise. Clara watched him closely. She kept that one in a drawer, said it was a reminder of where it all started. Arthur's throat tightened. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Or yours? Clara's voice was soft but firm. She believed in forgiveness, and I'm trying to believe in it too. Arthur looked up, meeting her gaze. Thank you for letting me see this, for letting me be here. Clara nodded, her expression guarded but not closed off. It's not easy, but I think she'd want us to try. They sat together, the weight of the past filling the room, but no longer suffocating. As the evening wore on, Arthur felt something shift between them, not a resolution, but the beginnings of a bridge, fragile yet strong enough to carry them forward. When Arthur left that night, the cool spring air felt lighter, the promise of new beginnings lingering in the quiet streets of Seabrook. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that forgiveness, true, lasting forgiveness, might finally be within reach. The following days in Seabrook passed with a quiet rhythm that Arthur had come to appreciate. Each moment at the community center, every shared glance or word with Clara, felt like a step toward rebuilding something fragile but meaningful. Spring had taken hold fully now, and the town seemed to mirror the renewal Arthur felt growing within himself. One crisp morning, Arthur arrived early at the center to find Clara already there, kneeling by the garden. She was tending to the flowers they had planted weeks earlier, her hands moving with care and precision. The soft light of dawn bathed her in a golden glow, and for a moment, Arthur stood silently, watching her. "You're up early," Clara said without looking up, her voice breaking the stillness. "I could say the same about you," Arthur replied, stepping closer. She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Old habits." Arthur knelt beside her, his knees sinking into the damp earth. "You've kept this place beautiful. Your mom would have loved it." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, her gaze softening. She always said a garden was a symbol of hope, that no matter how harsh the winter, things could grow again. Arthur nodded, his throat tight. She was right. They worked in silence for a while, the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds filling the air. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was hesitant but steady. "Arthur," she began, her hands brushing soil from her fingers. "Why did you come back, really?" Arthur leaned back, his gaze meeting hers. The question, though not unexpected, struck him deeply. He took a moment before answering, his voice low but firm. "Because I couldn't keep running from the truth," he said. "From you, from the life I walked away from." Clara studied him, her eyes searching his face. "And now that you're here?" "I want to stay," Arthur said earnestly, "to prove that I'm not the man who left, that I can be the father you deserve." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. "It's not easy for me to trust, Arthur. After everything, I've built my life around not needing anyone." Arthur's chest tightened, but he nodded. "I understand, and I don't expect trust overnight, but I'm willing to earn it, no matter how long it takes." Clara looked away, her gaze settling on the budding flowers. She always believed in second chances, she murmured. Arthur reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing against hers. "And I want to honor that belief. For her. For you." For a moment, Clara didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned her hand over, allowing his to rest against hers. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of years of pain and unspoken longing. "We'll see," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Arthur smiled, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "That's enough for me." Later that day, the community center was bustling with preparations for an upcoming spring festival. Volunteers darted about, carrying decorations and arranging tables. Clara moved among them with her usual efficiency, though there was a lightness to her demeanor that hadn't been there before. Arthur worked alongside her, helping where he could and staying out of her way when needed. As they strung lights across the hall, Clara turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the fundraiser," she said, "and the food drive. You've been consistent." Arthur raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "Is that your way of saying I'm not terrible at this?" Clara smirked, a rare moment of levity between them. "Maybe." As they finished hanging the lights, Clara hesitated, then looked at him directly. "I'm not good at this. Letting people in." Arthur nodded, his voice soft. "You don't have to be. It's not about being good at it, it's about taking a chance." Clara's gaze flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, perhaps, or the beginnings of trust. "I guess I'm learning." Arthur smiled, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "And you're doing better than you think." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur walked Clara home. The streets of Seabrook were quiet, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the faint salt of the sea. When they reached her cottage, Clara paused at the gate, her hand resting on the latch. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Arthur tilted his head, surprised. "For what?" "For staying," Clara said, her voice steady. "For not giving up." Arthur's throat tightened, but he managed a faint smile. "I promised you I wouldn't." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "Good night, Arthur." "Good night, Clara," he replied, watching as she disappeared inside. As he walked back to the inn, the cool night air felt lighter than it had in years. The bridge between them was still fragile, but it was no longer just a dream. It was real, and with each passing day, it grew stronger. For the first time, Arthur allowed himself to believe that the life he had once abandoned could be rebuilt, not perfectly, but beautifully, and with Clara by his side. The day of the spring festival dawned with a bright sky and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of blossoms and freshly turned earth. The community center buzzed with energy as volunteers finalized decorations, arranged tables, and set up booths outside on the newly thawed lawn. Arthur arrived early, his sleeves rolled up, ready to help however he could. Clara was already there, clipboard in hand, overseeing the setup. Her sharp eye caught every detail, and she moved through the chaos with practiced ease. Arthur watched her for a moment, struck again by her strength and grace. He approached cautiously, sensing that she was in her element, but not wanting to overstep. "Where do you need me?" he asked. Clara glanced up, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She gestured toward a pile of folding chairs near the stage. "Those need to be set up for the performances." Arthur nodded and got to work, falling into the rhythm of the morning. The festival was clearly important to Clara, and Arthur was determined to do his part to make it a success. As the hours passed, the lawn transformed into a vibrant scene of color and activity. Booths offering baked goods, crafts, and games lined the edges, while the center of the lawn was reserved for a small stage where local performers would entertain the crowd. By midday, families began to arrive, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Children darted between booths, their hands sticky with cotton candy and their faces painted with bright designs. Clara moved through the crowd, her smile rare but genuine, as she greeted familiar faces and ensured everything ran smoothly. Arthur found himself stationed at a booth selling tickets for the raffle. The steady stream of customers kept him busy, but his focus often drifted to Clara. She seemed lighter today, as though the weight she usually carried had lessened, if only for a moment. As the afternoon wore on, George appeared at Arthur's booth, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Looks like you're fitting in," he said with a grin. Arthur smiled. "Trying to pull my weight." George nodded, his gaze shifting to Clara. "She's been watching you, you know, even if she doesn't say it." Arthur followed George's gaze, his chest tightening. "Do you think she's starting to trust me?" George tilted his head thoughtfully. "A trust isn't something Clara gives easily, but she's letting you in, bit by bit. That's more than most people get." Arthur nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I'll keep showing up, for her." George clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. She deserves that." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the lawn in a golden glow, the performances on the stage drew to a close. Clara took the microphone, her voice calm but steady as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "This festival is a reminder of what we can build together, of the strength and beauty of this community. It wouldn't be possible without each and every one of you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Clara stepped down from the stage, her expression a mix of relief and satisfaction. Arthur caught her eye as she made her way through the crowd, and she approached him, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "You did good today," she said simply. Arthur smiled. "So did you. This place thrives because of you." Clara shrugged, but a faint smile tugged at her lips. "It's not just me. It's everyone who shows up." Arthur hesitated, then said softly, "I'm proud to be one of them." Clara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "I'm glad you're here." The words, simple but profound, hit Arthur like a wave. For the first time, he felt the fragile connection between them solidify into something real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. As the festival wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Arthur stayed to help with the cleanup. Clara worked beside him, their movements synchronized in a way that felt effortless. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken pain. Instead, it carried the weight of understanding. That night, as Arthur walked Clara home, the streets of Seabrook were quiet, the festival's energy giving way to the calm of evening. When they reached her gate, Clara paused, her hand resting on the latch. "Today was good," she said, her voice soft. Arthur nodded. "It was. You brought people together, Clara. Just like your mom always wanted." Clara looked away, her gaze distant. "I still miss her." "So do I," Arthur said quietly. "But she's still with us, in everything you've built." Clara's eyes flickered with emotion, and for a moment, Arthur thought she might say something more. Instead, she gave a small nod. "Good night, Arthur." "Good night, Clara," he replied, watching as she disappeared inside. As Arthur walked back to the inn, the cool spring air felt lighter, the promise of renewal lingering in the quiet streets. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that the life he had once abandoned could not only be rebuilt, but also grow into something beautiful. Clara had let him in, and that fragile bridge between them was no longer just a hope, it was a reality, and with each passing day, it grew stronger. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.